Welcome, everyone, to this virtual meeting of the Sexual Violence Prevention Network. Before we dive in, we have just a few housekeeping announcements. For anyone who needs captions, you can turn on the live transcript at the bottom of your screen. And ASL interpreters, we will provide instructions for viewing the ASL interpreters in the chat box. Finally, please remember to keep yourself muted anytime you are not speaking during our session today. If you have a question to ask or something to share, please do use the chat function. My name is Julia.tindell. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the Sexual Violence Prevention Program Planner at the Minnesota Department of Health. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to my co-host, Pogi del Rosario.
Thanks, Julia. I'm Pogi del Rosario, one of the prevention program coordinators at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I use he, him pronouns, and this is my first time in the co-host chair. Thank you all for being here.
Welcome to the team, Pogi. It's been so fun to get to work with Pogi so far, and just really thrilled to see our team growing and at full capacity right now. So it's just a real joy to have you here. Also on our planning committee are Hunter Beckstrom and Jude Foster from MNCASA and Mary Hopkins and Marissa Regay from MDH. Thank you to everyone who helped us to prepare for this meeting today. And for those of you who are new to these meetings, we host 4 quarterly SVPN meetings per year, and we have 3 goals for these meetings. First, we want to build our collective understanding of primary prevention of sexual violence. Primary prevention refers to the steps we can take to stop violence from ever happening in the first place. Primary prevention can happen in many different ways, but in SVPN, we like to focus on changes we can make in our communities and as a society.
Our second goal is to share resources related to sexual violence prevention. You'll find resources included in our quarterly meetings, which are recorded and saved on MNCASA's YouTube channel to access after our meetings. We also send out resources, events, and updates on the SVPN mailing list hosted by MDH that goes out every 2 weeks. MNCASA also shares prevention resources on our prevention email list. We also encourage you to sign up for updates from the organization Prevent Connect to stay connected to the work happening on a national level.
Our third goal for SVPN is connection, which leads us to our icebreaker for today. We would love to hear from you in the chat box. Please share your name, your pronouns, and what is one thing you hope to get out of our session today. And I'll start with Pogi. What do you hope to get out of the session today?
Well, being that this is the first time, I just hope it goes well. But also, I'm hoping to be challenged. I think I've always been kind of a sucker for untold stories or things that typically get left out of the narrative. And I always find those things to be really challenging to, maybe what I know and understand around really any issue. So I just hope to be challenged today, and I think he is going to deliver.
I think so too.
How about you, Julia?
For the record, you're doing amazing.
Thank you.
Oh man, something I'm looking forward to getting out of the session today is just like a different perspective, a different lens on this work. To broaden that perspective that I bring into the work and, deepen my understanding of what we do and how we've done it so that we can do it better. I'm just very psyched to learn. And I see we have in the chat, we've got some great responses coming in too. I see always interested in hearing what everyone's doing and connecting with other agencies. Yes, Pamela, please, everybody connect with each other in the chat during this session. We would love for you to walk away with an idea of somebody else to chat with and get connected with and work with deeper. Stephanie, welcome back to SVPN meetings. Hoping to get some ideas about sexual violence prevention in higher ed. And the great news is history of our movement for sexual violence is relevant to all of our work in prevention. So I am really excited to see how we'll be able to apply this work across different areas. I love seeing people, it looks like folks are excited about ideas, just to learn something new to them, to get an opportunity to hear about a new person's story. Thank you all so much for sharing what is bringing you to this meeting today. And as Pogi said, I believe in Kia. I'm so excited for this presentation. I've been looking forward to this for weeks now. So we hope that you will use today as an opportunity to do exactly all the things that you've named, to learn more, to meet some new people, and to make some connections. And now we have a very exciting announcement to make, which you may have already seen via our newsletter. And that is that this year, MNCASA and MDH have decided to select a theme for our Sexual Violence Prevention Network quarterly meetings. And that theme is exploring equity.
Oppression is the unjust, cruel use of power or authority by those in power to keep other groups of people from sharing power equally. Racism, sexism, ableism, and other forms of oppression are root causes of sexual violence. In contrast, health equity refers to the equal right to the experience of health and wellness, including equitable access to services and resources without any barriers or subpar care. Health equity is achieved when imbalances in power, privilege, and social and economic inequality are leveled to make a more equal playing field. We believe that equity is a key antidote to oppression and ultimately to sexual violence prevention. This year, we want to go even deeper and ask ourselves, what does it mean to be equitable in our work as preventionists? How can we hold the space for our SVPN gatherings in a more equitable way?
Thanks, Pogi. And we also want to recognize that equity is intimately related to intersectionality. You were all invited to view an introduction to intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw in preparation for Kia's presentation today. And we will post the link to the video in the chat in case you would like to watch it again and reference it later. So forgive us if some of this is about to be repeated, but we think it bears repeating. Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1989 and has continued to work to advance our collective understanding of intersectionality throughout her career in a variety of different areas. According to Crenshaw, the term intersectionality began as a legal term designed to draw attention to the ways that Black women's unique experiences of sexism, racism, and other forms of discrimination overlapped and created unique and distinct kinds of burdens that specifically white women and Black men did not experience in the same ways. In Crenshaw's words, structures make certain identities the consequence of and the vehicle for vulnerability. In other words, the systems of oppression Pogi just talked about are both targeting and blaming people with specific overlapping identities for their vulnerabilities to harm, such as sexual violence. It is critical for us to understand this dynamic if we hope to do sexual violence prevention work in truly equitable ways.
The concepts we've discussed so far are both incredibly complicated and are tied to a long and storied history that has influenced the anti-sexual violence movement we are a part of today. To help shine a light on this history and understand our connections to it today, we are excited to be joined by Kia Whittier from Violence Free Minnesota. Kia's presentation is titled History Behind the Movement, Sexual Violence, Advocacy, and Prevention. Welcome, Kia.
Oh, wow. What an introduction. Okay. Thank you, Pogi and Julia, for that. And welcome, everyone. Like Pogi had said, my name is Kia Whittier. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am the Membership and Outreach Program Manager at Violence Free Minnesota. Just a brief background on who I am. I came from previously, before I was at Violence Free Minnesota, I was at Standpoint as their underserved population support advocate. And before that, I was at the Aurora Center as their legal advocacy diversity coordinator. And then before that, I was at Alex House as a legal advocate and a youth advocate. So my foundation, and experience has all been rooted in just advocacy. I see I recognize some faces or names in the participants that I'm excited to, have here and be a part of this presentation. So one other thing I want to mention before I get started is I attended a presentation where the presenter described who they were, like physically, and I want to do the same, as I think that's another practice that we can include that makes sure our work is as accessible as possible. So I'm wearing a bright pink shirt or sweater. I have short curly hair. I'm wearing gold earrings, and I'm sitting in my sun room, I guess, with lots of plants behind me. And there's a lot of sun shining through. So that's a little bit about my physical appearance. I am identify as a multiracial Black woman. So there's another piece there. But just wanted to give a little context of who I am and the space in which I'm giving this presentation at. So with that being said, just a brief agenda. We're going to talk about why we're here, like literally why we're here today, give some definitions, talk about oppression and sexual violence, get into the history, and then provide a little summary. I will be talking the entire time. This is going to be, I would view this as a lecture, but I do encourage you all to, have conversations via chat. You're more than welcome to ask questions. Pogi and Hunter and Julia will all be monitoring the chat. I won't be looking at that, but if there are questions, they'll stop me and I will make sure that we get those questions answered. And if they don't, we'll get them answered later. So with that being said, why are we here today? Well, like in the introduction that Pogi and Julia gave, we're here because the SVPN and MNCASA, wanted to focus on racial equity, or at least equity as a whole, for this year, for this theme, right? So that's why we're here having this conversation. But digging a little bit deeper into that, we're here to understand the history, and it's necessary when we're developing ways to combat sexual violence. Our history, I would say, is rich and is dynamic, but it's often been silenced, or it's often silenced or forgotten about those who come from historically marginalized communities. And this plays a role in service provision and systems change work, especially when it doesn't serve victims and survivors equitably. And we're also here because it's our responsibility, right? I don't think any of us existed in the 16th century to create these various forms of oppression, but we're a part of a movement that has caused harm and has aligned with systems that have caused harm. So it's our responsibility to try and, correct that as much as we can, to push back against that and create a change when possible. And it's our responsibility because, again, I think as humans, we have to do something about it, right? That's as simple as I can put it. But with that, I want to get into the definitions, and I apologize that some of this might be repetitive for some folks. They may have an understanding of some of these terms already. That being said, though, I wanted you all to at least have an understanding of these definitions in the way that I'm using them and informing the information that will be shared throughout the presentation, right? And just to make sure we're, again, on the same page about everything. So when it comes to power, and if you've heard me present before, I love talking about power. It's one of my favorite things to discuss. But when it comes to power, there are 4 different kinds. We have individual, collective, institutional, and social power. When it comes to individual power, these are feelings of, this is power that an individual feels, sorry. These are feelings of individual strength, autonomy, and an expression. Then we have a collective power. And so that's the power that individuals feel when they come together, right? And this can kind of be thought of as synergy, right? Which I like. And it's basically when we think about 2 or more people coming together to produce a combined effect that's greater than the sum of their, separate parts. And we see collective power in examples of marches and protests and co-ops. And it's a theme that will be common throughout like the history that I'll be talking about. And then we have institutional power. And so that's power that comes from institutions. And it can be seen in some governments, monopolies, laws, and the systems that enforce them, like the police. And then lastly, we have social power. And social power is basically having access to resources that enhance one's chances of getting what they need in order to lead a comfortable, productive, and safe life. So then we get into target and oppressed identities. And so target identities are social groups that are really just deemed less valuable and are given limited access to resources and that social power. But on the other end, we have the agent or privilege identities, and these are social groups that are being viewed as positively valued, right? They're kind of considered the norm and have access to those resources and social power. And a lot of cultural norms are determined by these groups who do have that agent or privilege identity. So with privilege, another term that I'm sure y'all have heard before, I mean, I know you've heard it before, but just to get, an understanding where I'm coming from with this, is that privilege is the unearned access to resources. So that social power I talked about just a couple of slides ago, that are only readily available to some people because of their social group membership. And this comes at a disadvantage to others, right? But unearned and advantage are just key words that I really want folks to understand here. But in addition to privilege, in a patriarchal society, for example, women don't have institutional power, at least not based on their gender. And in a white supremacist society, people of color don't have race-based institutional power. And it's important to just bear this in mind because privilege can't go both ways, right? Black privilege, trans privilege, and poor privilege, they don't exist because those groups don't have institutional power. And I think people can often look at privilege individually rather than systemically. So what systems are in place that are allowing some groups to have power over others, right? And while individual experiences is like those things are important, absolutely. But we have to try to understand privilege in terms of these systems and societal patterns. We're looking at the rule here, right? Not the exception to the rule, okay? And that leads us to oppression. And so oppression is, I know it was just defined, but just to state it again, was a system of social control that benefits one group at the expense of another, right? And we see this, that it's rooted historically and maintained on an individual level, on institutional and a systemic level. And again, it just results in that condition of privilege for the agent group at the expense of that target group. And oppression, it continues through practices in so many ways, such as like labor exploitation or the unfair treatment of workers. We think about unequal distribution of resources, such as access to high quality healthcare or access to clean and healthy drinking water. We can see oppression through the unequal access to opportunities like educational and employment opportunities that are available to some people, but not others, right? And we can notice it in systems that are designed to just advance some groups over others, like how school districts are funded, right? These are all various forms of oppression. And again, we have to look at oppression and how it shows up on that institutional, that cultural and societal, and the individual and interpersonal levels, right? So when we're thinking about institutionally, what are the policies, the laws, the rules, and the customs that are at play? What about on a cultural and societal level, the social norms, the rituals, the roles, the language, the music, and the art that's centered? And then on an individual and interpersonal level, the attitudes and actions of others, right? And often I think when it comes to oppression that the aspects of our identity that are privileged can and do affect the aspects that are oppressed, yes, but privilege and oppression don't negate one another, right? Often I think folks can believe that they can't experience privilege because they experience oppression. And a very common example of that is the idea that poor white people don't experience white privilege because they're poor. But this isn't the case, because being poor doesn't negate the fact that as a white person, they may be less likely to become the victim of police brutality in most countries around the world. I mean, especially the United States, right? But being poor, we know is a form of oppression, absolutely. But this doesn't cancel out the fact that someone who is white and poor could still benefit from that white privilege, okay? And a poor Black person, on the other hand, won't have access to those resources, at least not as much, and is unlikely to be of the same race as the people that are in power, and is more likely to be harmed by racial prejudice. I know I said a lot right there, but racial equity. So racial equity is really a process of eliminating racial disparities and improving outcomes for everyone. And it's establishing these noticeable changes in the improvement of people's lives, right? These noticeable changes within policies, practices, and systems and structures that will positively, create change within the lives of people of color. When it comes to racial equity, we also have to look at racial inequity, though, right? Yes, we can, assume if we have racial equity, well, the opposite of that is racial inequity, but you have to look at it a little bit deeper and look at the how racial inequity is created structurally and on an institutional level and on an individual and interpersonal level. So I encourage you all to dive deeper into what that looks like. I'm not going to talk about that here right now, but just know that while we are talking about racial equity, it's important that we also examine racial inequity and how that is perpetuated. But some of this will just naturally come up throughout the history that I'm going to be talking about. And lastly, we have intersectionality. And Julia did a wonderful job of sharing what intersectionality is. And I really hope that you all had a chance to watch that video by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality. If you weren't able to watch the whole video, I hope at some point you can, because it's wonderful and it's a really powerful video to watch. But in thinking about intersectionality, it must inform our approach to ending sexual violence on any level. It must be intersectional, right? Because without it, we can't serve our most historically marginalized, our most vulnerable communities, right? But what I want to talk about here with intersectionality, instead of going over that video that you all watched, I want to highlight a framework that I feel like takes intersectionality and expands on it even more. And so what that is the Black women's triangulation of rape. And this was created by Kamala Johnson, the executive director of the Sasha Center in Detroit, Michigan, and her team. They created this Black women's triangulation of rape. And it was designed to give service providers and funders and just the community a chance to kind of see, I guess, get an overview, I would say, of the barriers that exist for Black women when it comes to sexual violence. And as you can see on the slide, it can be kind of confusing to look at, but policies and funding is what really fuels this triangle. And oppression, slavery, and these institutions are what this triangle is founded on, okay? And within this triangle, you can see all of the various forms in which Black women experience sexual violence, whether that be through stereotyping or through being dehumanized, through cultural appropriation, or just being devalued, being denied resources as a whole. There are many ways in which Black women are experiencing sexual violence that has to be looked at intersectionally. It can't be looked at as just a women's issue or a Black person's issue. It has to be intersectional. And that really is a lot of what our movement, the sexual violence movement, was founded on, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But this, again, this framework, the Black women's triangulation of rape, does an excellent job of, again, just highlighting the intersections of rape and sexual violence. So with a lot of these, I should have mentioned this in the beginning, and I'll say this throughout the presentation as well. I will be sharing with you all a list of resources and information and ratings that I've highlighted in this presentation, or things that I would highly encourage you to read up on, on your own. So know that information like the Black women's triangulation of rape will be in a document that you all can, learn more about. So that being said, though, I love this quote by Audre Lorde. It's just straight, simple to the point, and I think just highlights intersectionality in, a single sentence. There's no such thing as single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives, right? But with that, we know that intersectionality needs to be centered on the harms that institutions have caused and have created. So we have to understand and discuss oppression and sexual violence, because anti-oppression work is sexual violence prevention. I'm just going to take a drink of water. So how does it promote sexual violence? Well, specific types of violence such as genocide, transphobia, racism, ableism, they make sexual violence more likely to happen to people from historically marginalized communities, because oppression is creating these conditions where people who hold power are just at an increased risk of causing harm, and people with less power have increased vulnerability and increased exposure to those who cause harm, right? And oftentimes this is poverty related, but that's not always the case. And even then, if we're looking at it from, being poverty related, that is a result of our state and our systems, our institutions that have allowed for the, I would say, for some people to, have access to the resources and the things they need compared to others, right? And oppressive structures, they discourage cultural norms of healthy and collaborative and mutually respectful relating and relationships. And an example that I want to highlight here is focused on how genocide, violence, and racism against Indigenous people contributes to sexual violence. And that's by encouraging particularly white men to devalue the lives and the sovereignty of Native people, particularly Native women, and normalizing that sexual violence just towards devalued people in general, right? And setting Native people up to be vulnerable due to exploitation and a lack of resources, as well as stripping of legal rights and sovereignty, and promoting a reliance on state assistance that may put them in the path of more harm, right? And those who are offering that state assistance typically tend to be those who have power, right? And another example is that this destroys protective cultural norms of, like I said earlier, this respectful relating, and replacing them with dominant culture, patriarchal and white supremacist norms of objectification, of ownership, and of sexualized violence, right? And so in that example, though, it can be seen that imperialism promotes values of exploitation, of extraction, of degradation, of dehumanization and violence, and power for some at the expense of others, right? The common theme here is it's the power for some at the expense of others. And it's all on purpose, right? Like it was designed this way. But these, based on these values, the state exploits communities by stealing land and resources and violates folks using these campaigns of sexual, physical, and psychological violence, and exploits and disinvests in communities and removes resources from them, and then blames them for their own degraded and vulnerable conditions, which are a product of state intervention, right? I'm going to say that again, just to try and make sure folks understand. So in the example I'd given about how genocide, violence, and racism have been used against Indigenous people that contribute to sexual violence, we can see that those are the values that I would say that are centered here are values of exploitation, of extraction, the degradation and dehumanization, right? And based on those values, the state is exploiting these communities by stealing the land and resources, violating people using sexual violence, physical violence, psychological violence, and then exploiting and disinvesting in the communities, removing resources from them, and then blaming them for their own degraded and vulnerable conditions, which is a product of state intervention though, right? And I wonder, how would things be different if the state just didn't intervene using these tactics, right? I mean, that's a big question, but just something I think about. So with that, how does oppression harm positive, protective social norms and behaviors? Well, oppression relies on social structures where one group has power and access to resources at the expense of the others, right? Like I said, but it promotes significant barriers to equity, respect, and mutuality. And it shapes cultural norms, values, and stereotypes. And these impact experiences of gender and sexuality, as well as how people are talking about and experiencing sex and bodies and power, their own and others. And it interrupts really the human capacity to, I would say, be whole and healthy and in relation with other people. And many groups that have been targeted by oppression and violence have historically maintained positive cultural norms through intergenerational relationships between elders and young people, and through connection amongst peers. But through colonization and the cultural imperialism, the credibility of these of parents and elders relying, on this intergenerational relationship, that starts to diminish, and it's become damaged because people in those roles are shamed and discredited, and positive cultural norms are broken down by oppressive interventions and are replaced with dominant culture values and frameworks, typically being exploitation, violence, power over others. And this shapes how youth experience the world, right? How they view themselves, how they view others. And it, again, highlights that shaping of cultural norms, of values, and just the narrative as a whole. And it also just strips away any sort of agency and self-determination. Individuals are prevented from defining their own sexuality, and instead their sexualized stereotypes or projections get layered onto people in marginalized groups by dominant cultural forces that are defining really what people should and shouldn't look like or act like in relation to sex. And so people may be desexualized or hypersexualized, but either way, they're devoid of any sort of agency or self-determination. And we can see this in examples of, I would say, like Asian women are thought of as submissive, and within dominant culture, that could be viewed as an, often sought after or exotified quality for women in dominant culture when it comes to sex, whereas Asian men are portrayed and dehumanized as sexually passive. A quality, according to dominant cultural values, will be looked down upon for men. Or people with disabilities are assumed to be non-sexual, and people who are bisexual are assumed to be hypersexual, right? None of these groups of people have been able to, define for themselves their own sexual identities, right? And what that means for them. It's this dominant culture that has assumed and placed all of these terms, these various forms of repression onto these communities, okay? So how then does anti-oppression, or how do anti-oppression values prevent sexual violence? Well, there's a lot of wonderful values on this slide, and when they're applied to both structural functions and to individual relationships, they decrease sexual and domestic violence while promoting sexual and relationship health for all people. These are practices, or values, I should say, that directly contribute, again, to positive, like relating, positive mutuality and just understanding. And that also goes, or is in alignment with, I would say, these anti-oppression practices too. And while like conventional sexual and domestic violence work, while it may achieve significant positive outcomes, it can fall short sometimes of addressing the oppressive dynamics that really like deeply affect power, violence, sexuality, and relationships for historically marginalized communities. So we have to lean into these anti-oppressive values and these practices that will result in I would say the goal would be to, in preventing sexual violence from ever occurring, right? So that is essentially, how oppression can fuel sexual violence, but also how sexual violence is used as a tool of oppression. But really, to understand that even more, I think we need to dive into the history to really, outline how, we got to where we are today, okay? So the history, okay. Well, a lot of documented history of the movement. It begins around the 70s when the nonprofit sector became professionalized and when the first rape crisis centers were created. And these histories state, excuse me, that around this time, there are many survivors who began to speak out publicly, okay? However, that was, 53 years ago? And we know people existed before that time, and we know sexual violence existed before that time, which means there were survivors that were speaking out publicly, but due to these stories of sexual violence intersecting with race and, some of these folks or these groups being critical of the state, they're often forgotten about. And this leads to historical erasure. And when it comes to historical erasure, it's important that I think a way of looking at historical erasure is also looking at how stories are told in general, right? We have every story has characters, and when we're looking at the characters, we have to look at who is telling the story, who's missing from the story, and what role do both of those folks or multiple players really play in the shaping of the story. We have to examine like the conflict that's occurred, right? What are the various conflicts in the narrative and why do they exist? And how do different characters understand them? How is a conflict resolved? And are there new conflicts that arise from this? And same when it comes to the moral of the story, like what's the message that's being told about each character and how does power affect the moral for characters? And is the moral different for each character involved? And when I was learning about historical erasure previously, the framing of it when it came to just thinking about how a story is told or created really helped me in my understanding and framework of the sexual violence movement. Because knowing how history is written, recorded, and shared, it helps us be critical consumers of it. And just like stories, history, like I said, is made up of characters, of conflicts, and morals. And those components are determined by who writes our stories and the role they played in it. And understanding our history means understanding how historical narratives are created, why we're being told this story, and what information is being left out. But none of this can be separated out from the role that power and oppression play in who tells our historical narrative. And historical erasure is one of the ways that marginalized voices and contributions are kept silent. And by removing their stories, their experiences from history is removed, and oppressive systems, they stay in place. And to combat this, right, and to combat sexual violence, we have to understand our entire history first, right? And with historical erasure, we can see that there are powerful and privileged people that write history. The voices that challenge a dominant narrative are silenced. The norm is maintained and reinforced. Dominant groups appear as the only contributors to society, to history, and oppressive systems and practices are upheld. Okay, so you can see how it's a cycle, and it just continues until that cycle is disrupted, or until stories are that exist outside of the dominant culture are centered, I would say. All right, so we have to examine, so now that we have an understanding of what historical erasure is and the importance in combating historical erasure, and that being, you know, a form of combating sexual violence, because we have to understand that history, we also have to examine the tactics in which this country was founded on, okay? So to lay the early foundation out here, history of sexual violence and the anti-sexual violence movement in this country is a history of racism and sexism, straight up, right? Europeans, they came to Turtle Island, which is known now today as the United States. They came here to colonize, and they hypersexualized Native women through oppression and conquest and used that to maintain power. And rape was uncommon in Native communities. That's not always a story that was told, or at least a story that I grew up learning. And a lot of Native communities were a heavily matriarchal society, right? Women were in positions of authority and did a large portion of labor within their communities. So we have Europeans using rape towards Native women, and then we have Europeans kidnapping Africans through the transatlantic slave trade. And these kidnapped, you know, sorry, I'm not wording this correctly. They viewed folks in which they enslaved as less than. Europeans didn't believe or cared to believe that they could feel pain, or honestly that it even mattered if they felt pain or not, right? They were viewed as just less than. So we see the dehumanization, the devaluation of folks already from the foundation of what is now, you know, the United States. So with the dehumanization of Black people and the hypersexuation of Native women. These are two ways that colonizers tried to justify their violence in laying the foundation and fabric for the creation of this country. Enslavers, they used their power to exploit and cause harm, and they use it as a tool for submission and continued enslavement and domination. So we have sexual violence against women of color, particularly Black women, that's been used as a tool to reinforce a racial hierarchy made through white supremacy. And then we have sexual violence against women of color, Native women in particular, that has been used as a tool to reinforce colonization. It's a way to drastically alter cultures, establish dominance and fear, and mobilize people to commit violence against others and enact genocide, okay? I know I said a lot right there too. I want to pause for a second to let that process. So all that being said, we then have to understand the issues in which our movement was founded on, both before its professionalization and after. And you'll notice that there are intersecting issues from the very beginning. These are common themes that will be present throughout the stories I'm going to share, of self-defense, of collective power, of state violence, of criminalized survivors. But again, we notice the intersecting issues really being discussed, I would say, back to 1851, at least that I can document, right? Or at least that I found. And that's with Sojourner Truth. And I'm sure Sojourner Truth is someone you have heard before, so this may not be so new. But when we think about intersectionality, Sojourner Truth, in her anti-woman speech, she challenged the lack of concerns with Black issues by white women. And she's documented really as one of the first women to just connect these issues as a whole, right? So that was about 200 years after colonization, or at least the beginning of colonization, right? That we're noticing intersectionality, I guess, starting to really occur here, okay? But I also want to mention several stories before, again, the professionalization in the 70s of our movement that give examples of individual power, collective power, of self-defense and criminalized survivors that lay this foundation, okay? And some of these folks you may have heard before, some you may not have, but I hope that this at least brings to your attention the ways in which this directly contributes to racism and sexism, or I guess I should say the intersections of racism and sexism here, okay? So I first want to start with the Memphis riots. And when most folks think of the Memphis riots, they think that it was ignited by, well, and it was ignited by racial tension following the Civil War, but it typically just stops at that, leaving out the countless forms of sexual violence that occurred here. And so within the Memphis riots, it was mobs of white civilians and police that had attacked Black neighborhoods and assaulting and killing Black men, women, and children. And so during a congressional investigation into the riots, there were a group of 5 Black women survivors who testified in front of Congress about the gang rapes that they had experienced by these white mobs during the riot. And they're actually believed to be the first people to ever break the silence of rape in this capacity to Congress, okay? This is back in 1866. So the impact that this had is huge. But one of the women that I wanted to highlight here, her name is Frances Thompson, and she was actually formerly enslaved. And she's believed to be the first transgender woman to testify in front of US Congress. And there are, of course, many sad pieces to this story, but one of those pieces being that her testimony was thrown out 10 years after she testified, after an arrest and a medical examination was publicized, sharing that Frances Thompson was a transgender woman. And she was fined for that. I believe it was like $50 at the time. So she wasn't able to pay that fine. So she was thrown in jail and was sent out to be a part of a chain gang. And she, again, so I said she was formerly enslaved. She went back to that same, sort of system, which, contributed to, of course, the harm and violence towards Black women. And from that moment, I guess from that moment on, sorry, I should say, is people viewed Frances Thompson as not being credible because of what happened to her and her being a transgender woman. So silencing of survivors right away, criminalization of survivors right away, right? We're seeing this happen. Then that gets to the state of Missouri versus Celia. And so this is a case of rape, race, and slavery. Celia was an enslaved Black woman who was convicted of first-degree murder of her enslaver, Robert Newsom. And so she was convicted by a jury of 12 white men and sentenced to death. But her case was appealed to the Supreme Court, excuse me, of Missouri on the grounds that she killed Newsom to protect herself from being raped by him and that she had experienced countless amounts of sexual violence by him. However, the Supreme Court denied that appeal and declared that Celia was the property of her owner with no right to defend herself against sexual assault, and she was later hanged. And so I shared this story of Celia to share that this was at least a documented example of self-defense. And again, being criminalized for that, for protecting herself against, a form of violence, okay? Then we have Ida B. Wells, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. But at least when I learned about Ida B. Wells back in high school, I didn't learn about her in the form of anti-sexual violence work, right? And so that's what I want to highlight here. And I also don't think that that the efforts and initiatives that Ida B. Wells move forward have been highlighted enough within the anti-sexual violence movement. So Ida B. Wells in the 1890s, she organized a lot of anti-lynching campaigns and these campaigns were created to combat against existing rape laws that didn't protect Black women, but did justify the lynching of Black men when they were accused of raping white women, right? And this is seen as the earliest efforts to systematically confront and organize against rape. And at this time, rape was a capital offense, but only when a Black man had been accused of raping a white woman. But if a Black woman had been raped, it wasn't considered a crime. And previous examples can attest to that, right? But there is a quote here by Patricia Hill Collins in a book that I highly suggest called Black Sexual Politics. And what she says, which I think is in alignment with Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching campaigns, is that institutionalized lynching and institutionalized rape worked together to uphold racial oppression. Together, lynching and rape served as gender-specific mechanisms of sexual violence, whereby men were victimized by lynching and women by rape. It also reflected the type of binary thinking associated with racial and gender segregation, mandating that either race or gender was primary, but not both, okay? So she's, again, we're starting to see the intersections between race and sexism happening at this time. And while lynching was technically no longer legal, US law still found ways to codify that, but it just wasn't through lynching. It was through the creation, of prisons and various forms of capital punishment. So then we get to Reese Taylor. And Reese Taylor she was kidnapped and raped by 6 white men in Alabama. And these men had admitted to, sexually assaulting her, but the investigation was undermined by local law enforcement and 2 grand juries declined to indict the men. So no charges were ever brought, even though there was an admission, right? But where Rosa Parks comes into play here, and the Montgomery bus boycott, is that before Rosa Parks became one of like the central figures for the civil rights movement, she was actually an anti-sexual assault advocate and investigator. And so she worked alongside Recy Taylor, and they formed the Committee for Equal Justice for Miss Recy Taylor. And it was founded with the goal of assisting Black women in reclaiming their bodies against sexual violence. And how the Montgomery bus boycott plays into this, 10 years later here, because this is in 1955, there was a lot of sexual violence that had occurred towards Black women on buses, right? And so during the civil rights era, buses being commonplace for Black women to experience sexual violence, the Montgomery bus boycott was another effort to try and push back and combat against sexual violence. And so that, I think, is another strong example of collective power that is used here. Okay, last story before we kind of move into the professionalization kind of era of our movement, and that's with Betty Jean Owens. And so Betty Jean was a student at Florida A&M University, and she was in her car with a few other friends, and then 4 white men had approached their car and forced 2 men who were in the car out. So it ended up just being Betty Jean and one of her friends, okay? Well, her friend ended up being able to get away. And so then that friend and the 2 other guys, they went to the police to report what had happened and trying to find the men who had kidnapped Betty Jean. Well, these men, they ended up sexually assaulting Betty Jean 7 times. And when Betty was found, she was found in the back seat, bound and gagged, okay? So even as these men, they were found, even when they were found and they were arrested, while they were handcuffed, they were reportedly laughing and just giggling, like thinking that this was funny and that they would never get in trouble for ever raping a Black woman. But when news broke out about what happened to Betty Jean, it got back to the college campus, and about 1,500 students had gathered at an auditorium calling for justice for Betty. And they announced that they would petition the Florida governor. And the next day, about 1,000 students had staged a protest. Because the demonstrations were widely covered, which was a wonderful thing, it brought a lot of pressure on local law enforcement to take action. And so they did. And the judge in this case had called a grand jury, and there were about 200 people who were watching during this grand jury. But in between that time, there were large groups of people who had demonstrated protests, one in Atlanta, one in Atlanta, and then another one in San Francisco. What ended up happening with this case is that the defense, tried to portray Betty in the same way that the men had viewed her, and that was just dehumanizing and degrading and devaluing. That being said, though, these men actually ended up being sentenced life in prison, making it the first time that white men were ever convicted of raping a Black woman, in Florida at least. 5 years later, though, one of the men was paroled, and he was out for revenge, and he ended up murdering a Black woman who he thought was Betty. And turned out that that woman, it was not the same woman. And so we see continuous harm occurring. Like this man still had it out for her, even though he's the one who caused harm. And he did it twice, right? But this highlights the collective power that was used to create change and apply pressure, and thinking about the anti-sexual violence movement efforts on college campuses. I think this is a solid, strong example of the power that students have to really create that change. So, let me go back here. So at this point, our field is professionalized, and within the 70s at least, which means we're receiving more documentation about the history. And this documented history really focusing on criminalized survivors and critiques of the state. So the following stories about Yvonne Wanrow and Joanne Little and Desi Woods and Inez Garcia, these are all criminalized survivors who really, their stories came to light right at the same time as our movements became professionalized. So with Yvonne Wanrow, Yvonne was is a member of the Colville tribes of Eastern Washington, and she shot and killed a convicted sex offender when he attempted to assault her son. And so Yvonne was convicted of murder and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but appealed that verdict. And her conviction was reversed just a few years later on the grounds that the police had illegally used her 911 call as evidence against her. But in response, the state of Washington appealed the reversal to the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court, though, ended up siding with Wanrow and issued a ruling stating that the jury should have considered perceptions of the situation, including those perceptions which were the product of, history of sex discrimination. And her conviction was overturned, though, and a new trial was scheduled, and she ended up pleading to lesser charges and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. But during and after this time, she really became heavily involved in activism for Native women and their rights. And this decision really marked the first time that a state's highest court determined that gender was a part of the context from which a jury should determine the reasonableness of a defendant's self-defense claim, okay? So really just viewed as one of the first women's self-defense cases we see here, but also, a criminalized survivor. And even though Yvonne, at least from what we know at this point in her story, hadn't experienced sexual violence, the analysis of self-defense and defense strategies that grew from her case, again, really were the underpinning for many other self-defense cases that had followed. And so we can see that with Inez Garcia and Joanne Little, both whose stories came at the same time in 1974. But so with Inez Garcia, she was a Puerto Rican and Cuban woman who was convicted in 1974 of second-degree murder in the death of a man who had stood guard while another man had sexually assaulted her. And so while Inez was exonerated in 1977, her case is viewed as another foundational moment in what's considered now like the battered women's defense argument, okay? And her case gained a lot of public attention, especially given just the anti-rape politics of the women's movement in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. And through that, the Inez Garcia Defense Committee was created, and it became a strong grassroots campaign that was led by majority white lesbian women in that Bay Area. Okay, so what I want to mention here with Inez's story is while the collective power used to gain attention on her case was without a doubt strong, the Inez Garcia Defense Committee became co-opted by the majority of white women leading that effort. These women wanted to be recognized for their work in supporting a fellow woman while ignoring how their longing to be seen minimize the intersectional issues that were at play in Inez's case. The agency within her story had been centered largely on this defense campaign. And I think this just highlights how survival actions against sexual violence are criminalized unless it's garnered attention by the white liberal feminist movement. Okay. Note that just 2 years prior, the first rape crisis centers were established, which was centered on white middle-class women. Okay. So we're noticing this theme of, even if it's well-intentioned, the co-option or folks co-opting movements or stories. And while there is change and great change that can come from that, what are we really focusing on? What were these movements really focusing on here? Okay. So that brings me to Joanne Little at that same time, 1974. And so Joanne, I know it looks like it's Joan, but her name is pronounced Joanne. She is a Black woman who was in the Beaufort County Jail, North Carolina, and was attacked and raped by a white guard at the jail. And she was actually able to break free and ended up killing him in self-defense. And then she was able to break free from the jail. There was this massive, massive search for Joanne, and she ended up turning herself in a week later and was charged with murder. But there was this national outcry for justice, and a lot of organizations specifically focusing on Black liberation, such as the Southern Poverty Law Center, really joined in on these efforts to try and set Joanne free and share a story. And so in 1975, a jury ended up acquitting her of killing him. And she actually ended up being the first woman in US history to be acquitted of using the defense that she used deadly force to stop the sexual assault. And I think Joanne paved the way for, just a few years later, Inez Garcia being exonerated. So that leaves us leads us to Desi Woods. And so Desi Woods was a Black woman who was sent to prison in Georgia for defending herself and her friend against a sexual assault by a white man. So Desi ended up shooting and killing this man with his own gun after he attempted to rape her and threatened to kill her when she fought back. The state did not like that Desi fought back against a tactic that has been used to maintain the subjugation of Black people, that being rape of Black women by white men, right? So she was sentenced actually to 22 years in the Georgia Women's Institute of Corrections. And during that time, while she never served at 22 years, and I'll get to that in just a second, she had experienced nude solitary confinement, forced druggings, and beatings. And there was also, I would say, a lot of collective power that was used, a lot of collective power that was centered around Desi Woods and her story. There ended up being about 20 or more than 20 errors by the trial court in her case. However, the Supreme Court of Georgia denied Desi Woods' appeal and ended up, they upheld her conviction. And so in January of 1981, after she had served 5 years, she was released from prison. And a lot of that is on the efforts of this collective power that organizations and groups had used outside, I would say, outside of the mainstream anti-sexual violence movements, okay? But that brings us to recent history. So up until this point, I've shared stories about victims and survivors who have been criminalized and who were using self-defense, right? And the collective power that a lot of movements had, created in order to push back against these systems that were causing this harm. But to go even further, and I guess think about another type of harm that has occurred, I feel like we have to talk about police sexual violence. I mean, as social media, I guess, really, has brought a lot of stories and cases to the forefront, especially when it comes to police violence. I don't think we have necessarily looked at the intersecting issues between police sexual violence and racism here. And there are just a few stories that I want to highlight that really, I think, detail this. Okay, so I want to start with Tiawanda Moore. And so Tiawanda and her boyfriend, they had a history of an abusive relationship, okay? And police were sometimes called, but during this particular incident, Tiawanda and her boyfriend had got into a fight. Boyfriend called the police, and by the time they arrived, the situation had kind of calmed down. Well, police, they separated Tiawanda and her boyfriend so that they could be interviewed individually. The officer who interviewed Tiawanda began groping her and wrote his phone number down for her on a piece of paper, and gave it to her and said, "Call me." Well, she and her boyfriend ended up going down to the police station to file a complaint. And the investigators that met with Tiawanda tried to talk her out of filing a complaint at all, and just saying that the officer had a good record and that he would do better and would leave her alone. Well, the officers left the room for a second, and Tiawanda, just feeling pressured to not say anything, right, and drop the complaint, she decided to record them on her cell phone to show that they weren't helping her. Well, investigators, they realized that she was recording them, and so she was arrested and charged with 2 counts of eavesdropping for violating this law called the Illinois Eavesdropping Act. And it's a state law that criminalizes the recording of public conversations without the consent of everyone involved. And when police officers are recorded, potential penalties are only going to increase. And she could have faced 15 years in prison for that. But a jury, when it came to trial, a jury remained unconvinced that she was in the wrong whatsoever. And they thought that the investigators she recorded just came off as intimidating and extremely insensitive. And they deliberated for a little over an hour and acquitted her on charges. So while there wasn't this mass movement or collective power that was used or that stood behind Tiawanda Moore, it's an example of a survivor potentially being criminalized, right, for self-defense, standing up for herself by recording an agent of the state who directly contributes to, state-sanctioned sexual violence. That also leads to Holtzclaw case. And so Daniel Holtzclaw, he was a former police officer in Oklahoma who had sexually assaulted about 13 women while he was on duty, all of whom are Black women. And the majority having previous warrants, being drug users or sex workers, which, as you may have already started to think about, he used to hold over their heads if they didn't comply. Well, one of the first women he assaulted, he did so while she was handcuffed to a hospital bed. Another woman he had sexually assaulted, he did so while he pulled her over for no reason whatsoever, actually. And so these are 2 women. I actually couldn't find their names. I tried, wasn't able to find them, but these are 2 women who had broken the silence on that case. But the trial received very little attention, actually, from the media or within the mainstream anti-sexual violence movement. But local activists and national organizations like Black Lives Matter and African American Policy Forum and Black Women's Blueprint, they organized local support in this national response. And this focused on the lack of media attention of sexual violence against Black women and girls. And Daniel Holtzclaw, he was found guilty and sentenced to 263 years in prison. And I wonder, would this have been the same results if these organizations hadn't created these organizing efforts on this like mass front. And the last individual story that I want to share is the story of Sharnicia Corley. And so Sharnicia was pulled over in a Texaco parking lot in Houston for allegedly running a stop sign and failing to use a turn signal. And in the dash cam video footage, it shows that she's made to stand and is handcuffed outside her car while two officers are looking inside the car. And she's then searched and put on the ground and then is naked below the waist. Sharnicia ended up having a cavity exam done on her for about 11 minutes by an officer using a flashlight. And sorry, every time I share this story about her, it's really heavy just to think about that situation. And two officers were charged with official oppression, but the charges were later dismissed and nothing came of it. And in the county in which this happened in Texas, they agreed to pay about $185,000 to settle this lawsuit. And according to her attorney stated that they just felt like they were backed against a wall and they called it an injustice and just felt like they were about to end up with zero. And so I share these stories to highlight the harm that has been caused to Black women and the consequences that they face, whether that's them being criminalized, their stories just being silenced or never even discussed, such as like Sharnicia Corley's story, and just the lack of attention that is brought to this issue. And again, I would also say the lack of recognizing like the intersections between this all within our movement, within the anti-sexual violence movement. But I want to highlight too, I want to highlight examples of collective power and critiques of the state through organizations and movements. So I discussed some individuals that had a lot of collective power, at least the majority of collective power used to try and bring attention to their stories and create change. There are also, again, a lot of organizations and groups that were doing the same. So I want to start with the Combahee River Collective. And so this is in 1974. This is just 2 years after like the first rape crisis centers were created and when within the nonprofit sector being professionalized. And so the Combahee River Collective was a Boston-based organization of Black feminists, many of whom were lesbians. And throughout 1974 to 1980, the collective was critical of mainstream white feminism. And they pointed out the discrimination and bigotry that many white feminists had directed towards women of color, towards poor people, LGBTQ women, and others during what is known as this like second wave period of feminism. And in 1977, the collective issued a Combahee River Statement. And in this statement, they discussed that community organizing and liberation work has to center the most marginalized group, Black women, because their freedom guarantees everyone's freedom and would mean the dismantling of all oppressions. And so these organizations that I'm mentioning here, some of the statements that they have, I'm going to just like briefly highlight, but like I said earlier in follow-up from this presentation, I'll be including like links and information to all of these statements that you can read more about, and I really encourage you to. But in 1977, we have the Santa Cruz Women Against Rape, and this is another group who is pretty critical of where our movement is headed. And so the group wrote this powerful letter to the anti-rape movement that just echoes many of the same criticisms that we're hearing today. And part of what they say, which I'll share, is that We do not believe that rape can end without the present capitalist race, we do not believe that rape can end within the present capitalist, racist, and sexist structure of our society. The fight against rape must be waged simultaneously with the fight against all other forms of oppression. So they're already talking about intersectionality here, right? And then they go on to say that this tendency to work with the criminal justice system is reinforced by the fact that many groups are supported through government funds. Because of this, there is an inevitable push, if not outright contractual obligation, to persuade women to report rapes to the police. So that was a statement that they issued in 1977. And I'm sure a lot of you within this group are in this space, and those who eventually, will listen to the recording, probably heard some of these same issues or critiques being discussed today, right? So we're not, learning about anything, or I guess nothing new is being discussed here. We know the issues and critiques that occurs within our movement, right? And they highlighted that from the very beginning. And there's a solid, I think, opportunity to try and create change from the very beginning. So we aren't where we are right now. However, those stories are kind of pushed to the margins, are silenced. That leads to critical resistance and Insight. If you haven't heard of those organizations, I encourage you to check them out. Critical Resistance was formed in 1997 when activists were challenging the idea that imprisonment and policing are a solution for social, political, and economic problems. And Insight is a network of radical feminists of color that organized to end state violence and violence within homes and communities. But in 2003, they actually came together to create an Insight critical resistance statement. And this statement highlights some of the exact same things from, a couple decades earlier that the Combahee River Collective and the Santa Cruz Women Against Rape were discussing. Just due to time, I'm not going to highlight that, but again, I will share in that resource list with you all. And that's the same with interrupting criminalization in 2018. And that was an initiative that's led by researchers and activists, Marianne Kaba and Andrea J. Ritchie. And interrupting criminalization really just aims to, of course, interrupt and end the growing criminalization and incarceration of women, girls, trans and gender nonconforming people of color for criminalized acts, right? And another organization, which I will share, and I encourage you to look into. They have a plethora of resources on their website that, and they have like toolkits and campaigns and a lot of resources that I use when I've, created certain, materials, but I've definitely leaned on them as an organization who is or has, created movements or discourse around around anti-carceral feminism, which is what our movement is also founded on, which can make some folks uneasy talking about the abolishment of our, prison system. But when we're talking about the stories, like ones I have just shared earlier, it all has to do with criminalized survivors and folks who didn't necessarily want the, person to go to prison. Maybe they did, but we see that the carceral state is just used as another form of oppression and a form of sexual violence. So just a lot of intersecting issues at play here. Okay, and that leaves me, and I only have 4 minutes left, so I'm almost done though. And that is with missing, murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks. You may be wondering, that didn't happen in 2021. You're right, it didn't. It absolutely didn't. But I'm using this as a date because I believe it seems as though it resurfaced within the masses around this time, but that is in direct alignment with the murder of Gabby Petito, which leads to missing white women syndrome. So what I want to highlight here really is that, let me say first though, that Sheila North Wilson, she's actually the first person who, at least we know, coined the term or the hashtag missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that is really kind of directed or led some of the efforts within the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit folks. But through Gabby Petito, who I'm sure you all are familiar with, through her murder, her case sparked a national outcry of just support. Her case received an outstanding amount of support, and there was a lot of collective power that was used there. And social media, I think, is a direct contributor to that. And in no way, shape, or form am I, saying anything bad about what the efforts that were used to help find Gabby's body. That's not the case. But what I do want to highlight here, though, is we can see a stark contrast between the efforts that were used in Gabby's case compared to in Wyoming, where Gabby's body was found. 710 Indigenous people were reported missing between 2011 and 2022. But their bodies were never found. And we can, I would say, contribute this to what has been called the missing white women syndrome. And so it's a term that was actually first coined by a journalist and news anchor, Gwen Ethel, in 2004. And it's a phenomenon by news media to routinely ignore missing BIPOC folks in favor of covering attractive, cisgendered, white middle-class women. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight something because it's relevant today, as of February 13th, 2023, is the missing and murdered African-American women. And so this is a task force that was created during the 2021 legislative session. But today, legislation establishing this office has reached its final committee stop. And so I'm not sure the status of where that's at, but I hope by the end of this presentation, the office will be a go, and we can start to see efforts on a macro level being addressed to address the missing and murdered African-American women. I know I said a lot, I have 1 minute left, but that leads to a summary, okay? So we're almost done. Thank you so much for bearing with me, y'all. Okay, so when it comes to combating sexual violence, we know that we have to take this intersectional approach that centers and addresses forms of racism, sexism, and, in other cases, other forms of discrimination, right? But it also means that we have to acknowledge our history. And that means that we have to address historical erasure and prevent it from ever happening in the first place. We have to understand these policies, practices, and systems and institutions that just lead to all of this occurring in the first place. And it's okay that I think our movement, we have to focus on sexual violence, but there needs to be an intersectional approach that understands these other forms of oppression that are contributing to the harm that folks experience. And so that, I think, leads to a movement within a movement, right? We need to uplift and center stories of that aren't being told as loudly, and uplift those stories that just aren't being told at all. And we need to create I would say larger forms of collective power that really lean into the, I was going to say power, I guess power that we all have to create change. So we need to think about what our relationship to power looks like on an individual level, but as a movement that has been influential, I would say, in creating change, and can continue to be one if we, I would say, I think, lean on some of the stories of these folks who I've just mentioned, and making sure that, this stuff never happens again. I hope that last part made sense. But what I will do, I'm thinking about time now, is I'm going to send some resources to Julia, and I will make sure that gets out to you all, that you can continue to read more. But I hope this kind of helped establish just a little bit of an understanding of where a movement has been and where it could go if we really take that truly intersectional approach in combating sexual violence. So thank you so much.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Kia. This was just an unbelievable, powerful presentation. And I hope you see the thank you, the gratitude is flowing in through the chat. I just want to take a breath and let it sink in. I'm so grateful that we recorded this presentation, because it means we can go back and watch it again and make sure that we're just absorbing this information. And I'm so excited to get those additional resources and references, because I just am feeling so, personally, I'm feeling so compelled to go deeper. And as you said, to prevent that historical erasure from ever happening again. So we really cannot thank you. Thank you enough. We have a couple of announcements that we would like to make as we are wrapping up today. And I will pop it over to Pogi to get us started with those.
Sure. Thanks, Julia. First, please save the date for our next SVPN meeting, which is currently scheduled for Monday, Monday, May 15th, 1 to 2:30 p.m. The topic for this session is to be announced, but it will build on our 2023 theme of embracing equity. We also want to take a moment to highlight that tomorrow, February 14th, is the 2023 Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives March. We know that there will be events happening statewide, and we welcome you to share them in the chat. There's one event that we want to highlight in the Twin Cities. The Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition is co-hosting a march for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, boys, LGBTQI+, Two-Spirit, and transgender relatives tomorrow. No registration is needed, and the event is free to attend. Participants are asked to wear red and to bring banners, posters, staffs, drums, and rattles. The march will take place from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. With speakers beginning at 11 a.m. and the march beginning at noon. More information can be found on Facebook.
Thanks, Pogi. I will be there. I hope to see many of the rest of you there. We may not have ever met in person before, so please come and introduce yourself. If you see me, I'd love to meet you. We also have an announcement from the Minnesota Department of Health. The 2022 Minnesota Student Survey data is now available. We will post a link to more information about the 2022 MSS in the chat. The Sexual Violence Prevention Program is available to help individuals and communities with accessing this data to support prevention efforts statewide. If you would like assistance finding information about sexual violence in your community using the MSS, you can contact Marissa Regay, whose information is already in the chat. And if you have any announcements, events, resources, or other items you would like to share with the group, please do post those in the chat as well.
We have one final request before you go. Hunter, can you launch the poll question? Instead of sending out a post-meeting survey, we'd like to ask you to answer a question in the poll to help us evaluate our session today. The prompt for the poll is, this meeting helped me. So you can select one or more of the following answers. Gain knowledge about primary prevention of sexual violence, gain knowledge about the history behind the anti-sexual violence movement, learn about a resource, identify someone to connect with, think of an action I can take based on what was discussed, and other. Please share in the chat.
And we would also love for you to take a moment to share in the chat box any suggestions or requests you have for future SVPN quarterly meetings, especially if you have ideas of ways that we can build on our theme and this excellent presentation today to grow our capacity to embrace equity as a community. You can also send suggestions to me or Pogi, and I'm going to put our contact information in the chat for you as well.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this meeting of the Sexual Violence Prevention Network. We hope you enjoyed today's meeting, and we look forward to seeing you next time.